The morning sky looked wrong. Sarah Chen had lived in the mountains of North Carolina for 12 years, but she had never seen clouds this color. They hung low and heavy, with a sickly yellow-green tint that made her stomach turn. The weather reports had been talking about unusual atmospheric conditions for days, but nobody really understood what was happening. Sarah worked as a park ranger in the Pisgah National Forest. She loved her job because it meant spending most of her time outdoors, protecting the wildlife that called these mountains home. Today felt different though. The air smelled sharp and metallic, like pennies left in the rain. She was walking the morning patrol route when the first drops started falling. At first, she thought it was normal rain. But, when the droplets hit her jacket, they sizzled slightly and left tiny burn marks on the fabric. Sarah quickly pulled up her hood and picked up her pace. This was not ordinary rain. The weather station had warned about possible acid precipitation due to a rare combination of industrial pollution and atmospheric pressure changes. A chemical plant 3 states away had experienced a major leak 2 weeks ago, and the contaminated air mass had been moving slowly across the region. When it finally met the right conditions over the Appalachian Mountains, it created something nobody had seen before: rain with a pH level so low it could burn skin and kill plants on contact. Sarah reached for her radio to report the dangerous conditions, but before she could speak, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a tiny, desperate peeping coming from somewhere near her feet. She looked down and saw something that broke her heart. A small bird had fallen from its nest. But this was not just any baby bird. Its feathers were completely white, and its eyes were a pale pink color. Sarah had studied wildlife for years, and she recognized the signs immediately. This was an albino hatchling, probably less than a week old. Albino animals were incredibly rare in the wild, and they faced enormous challenges just to survive under normal circumstances. Their lack of protective pigment made them vulnerable to sunburn, and their poor eyesight made it hard for them to find food or avoid predators. But now this tiny creature faced an even more terrible threat. The acid rain was falling directly on its delicate skin and thin feathers. Sarah could see small red marks where the corrosive water had already started to burn. The baby bird was crying out in pain and fear, unable to understand why the sky was hurting it. Sarah did not hesitate. She pulled off her waterproof gloves and gently scooped up the hatchling. The bird was so small it fit easily in her cupped palms. She could feel its tiny heart beating frantically against her fingers. Its body temperature was dropping fast, and its breathing was shallow and rapid. Looking up, Sarah could see the nest the bird had fallen from. It was about 15 feet up in an old oak tree, tucked into a fork where 3 branches met. She could hear more peeping coming from above. This hatchling had siblings who were probably also in danger from the acid rain. But right now, she had to focus on saving the one in her hands. The rain was getting heavier, and Sarah knew she had to get the bird to shelter immediately. Her ranger station was half a mile away through the forest. She carefully tucked the hatchling inside her jacket, close to her body heat, and started running. As she ran, Sarah's mind raced with questions. How long could a baby bird this young survive away from its parents? What kind of bird was it? The white coloring made it impossible to tell what species it belonged to. Would its parents come back for it after the storm passed? And, most importantly, how could she keep it alive? The acid rain was now falling hard enough to sting Sarah's exposed skin. She could hear it hissing as it hit the leaves around her. Some of the plants were already starting to show damage. Their leaves were turning brown at the edges and curling up. If the rain could do this to mature plants, what was it doing to the other baby animals in the forest? Sarah reached the ranger station and burst through the door, dripping wet and breathing hard. Her colleague Marcus looked up from his desk with surprise. "Sarah? What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's not a ghost," Sarah said, carefully opening her jacket. "But it might be just as rare." Marcus came over to look, and his eyes widened when he saw the tiny white bird. "Is that what I think it is?" "Albino hatchling," Sarah confirmed. "Found it in the acid rain. It's in bad shape." Marcus immediately went to their emergency supply cabinet and pulled out a small heating pad and some soft towels. Sarah gently placed the bird on the warm surface and covered it partially with a towel. The hatchling's eyes were closed, but it was still breathing. "We need to call the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center," Marcus said, reaching for the phone. "Wait," Sarah said. "Look outside." They both turned to the window. The acid rain was now falling so heavily they could barely see the parking lot. The weather service was broadcasting emergency warnings, telling everyone to stay indoors and avoid contact with the precipitation. No one's going to be able to travel in this, Marcus realized. "We're on our own." Sarah looked down at the tiny bird. It had stopped peeping and lay very still on the heating pad. Its breathing was getting weaker. She had rescued injured animals before, but never anything this young and fragile. And never under these circumstances. "Do we have any emergency supplies for baby birds?" she asked. Marcus shook his head. "Nothing specific. Some basic first aid supplies, but nothing for feeding or caring for hatchlings." Sarah felt a wave of despair. She had saved the bird from the acid rain, but now what? Without proper food and care, it would probably die anyway. She thought about its parents, who were probably desperately searching for their missing baby. She thought about the other hatchlings in the nest, exposed to the burning rain. But then, she looked at the tiny creature lying in front of her, and her determination returned. This bird had survived falling from its nest. It had survived the acid rain long enough for her to find it. It was fighting to live, and she was going to fight right alongside it. "We'll figure it out," she said firmly. "We'll do whatever it takes." The rain continued to fall outside, but Sarah was already making plans. She thought about everything she knew about bird care from her wildlife training. She remembered articles she had read about hand-raising orphaned birds. She thought about the veterinary supplies they had on hand and how they might be adapted for a situation like this. The hatchling stirred slightly and opened its pale pink eyes for a moment. Sarah took this as a good sign. The bird was weak, but it was still alive. And, as long as it was alive, there was hope. Marcus had found their emergency contact list and was making phone calls, trying to reach anyone who might be able to offer advice. The phones were working, even if travel was impossible. Maybe someone could talk them through the basics of caring for a baby bird until the storm passed. Sarah sat down next to the heating pad and gently stroked one finger along the hatchling's back. Its feathers were so soft they felt like down. She could see that some of the acid burn marks were already starting to heal, now that the bird was warm and dry. "You're safe now," she whispered to the tiny creature. "We're going to take good care of you." Outside, the acid rain continued to fall, turning the beautiful forest into a dangerous wasteland. But, inside the ranger station, a small miracle was taking place. A human and a bird had found each other in the storm, and together they were going to fight for survival. Sarah did not know it yet, but this was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey. The next few days would test everything she knew about wildlife care and push her to limits she never thought possible. She would learn things about herself and about the remarkable resilience of nature that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The albino hatchling had no way of knowing that it had just met its guardian angel. All it knew was that the burning pain had stopped, and it was warm again. For now, that was enough. As the storm raged outside, Sarah began the first phase of what would become the most challenging and rewarding rescue mission of her career. She had no idea that this tiny white bird would soon become famous around the world, or that its story would inspire thousands of people to care more about protecting wildlife. All she knew was that a helpless creature needed her help, and she was determined to provide it. The acid rain had brought destruction to the forest, but it had also brought Sarah and the hatchling together. Sometimes the worst disasters lead to the most beautiful outcomes. The healing had begun, for both the bird and the forest that would eventually become its home again. But, first, they all had to survive the storm. The first night was the longest of Sarah's life. She stayed at the ranger station, taking shifts with Marcus to watch over the tiny hatchling every few minutes. They had managed to reach Dr. Patricia Williamson, a wildlife veterinarian 2 hours away, who talked them through emergency care procedures over the phone. The most important thing right now is keeping it warm and hydrated, Dr. Williamson had explained. Baby birds that young need to be fed every 20 to 30 minutes during daylight hours. They dehydrate quickly, especially after trauma. Sarah had carefully mixed a solution of electrolytes and water using supplies from their first aid kit. Using a tiny syringe without the needle, she dropped small amounts of the mixture at the corner of the hatchling's beak. At first, the bird was too weak to respond, but gradually it began to swallow the liquid. By morning, the acid rain had stopped, but the damage outside was heartbreaking. Trees that had stood for decades were stripped of their leaves. The normally clear stream that ran behind the station was now murky and lifeless. Plants that had been green and healthy yesterday were brown and wilted. But, inside the station, there was hope. The albino hatchling was stronger. It was holding its head up and responding to sounds. When Sarah approached with the syringe, it opened its beak expectantly. Its pale pink eyes seemed more alert, and it had even managed to produce a few weak peeps. "I think it's going to make it through the first crisis," Marcus said, watching Sarah feed the bird. "But what happens next? It's going to need more than sugar water to grow." This was the question that had been keeping Sarah awake. Baby birds in the wild are fed constantly by their parents, who bring them insects, worms, and other protein-rich foods. Sarah had no experience with preparing proper food for a hatchling, and she was terrified of making a mistake that could harm the bird. Dr. Williamson arrived just after noon, as soon as the roads were declared safe for travel. She was a small woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and kind eyes that had seen every kind of wildlife emergency imaginable. She had brought a bag full of specialized supplies and equipment. "Let's take a look at our patient," she said, setting down her bag and washing her hands thoroughly. Sarah watched nervously as Dr. Williamson examined the hatchling. The veterinarian's hands were gentle but professional as she checked the bird's breathing, heart rate, and reflexes. She looked carefully at the acid burn marks and felt along the bird's body for any signs of injury from the fall. "This is remarkable," Dr. Williamson said finally. "This little one has been through tremendous trauma, but I don't see any permanent damage. The acid burns are superficial and already healing well. No broken bones from the fall. And look at this." She gently extended one of the hatchling's wings. "Perfect development for its age. This bird has strong genetics, despite the albinism. With proper care, I think it has an excellent chance of surviving to adulthood." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. "So what do we do now?" "Now comes the really hard part," Dr. Williamson said with a smile. "We raise a baby bird." Over the next several hours, Dr. Williamson taught Sarah everything she needed to know about hand-raising a hatchling. They set up a proper brooder using a plastic container, heating pad, and soft towels. The temperature had to be kept between 85 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit, with high humidity to help the bird's developing feathers. The feeding routine was more complex than Sarah had imagined. Dr. Williamson showed her how to prepare a special formula using commercial hand-feeding mix designed for baby birds. The mixture had to be the right temperature. Too hot would burn the bird's throat, too cold would lower its body temperature dangerously. "The feeding schedule is crucial," Dr. Williamson explained as she demonstrated the technique. "Every 30 minutes from sunrise to sunset. No exceptions. Miss too many feedings, and the bird will weaken quickly." Sarah learned to use a small syringe to deliver the formula directly into the hatchling's mouth. The bird had to be held upright so it wouldn't choke. Each feeding took about 10 minutes, including cleaning time. With 18 hours of daylight, that meant 36 feedings per day. "How long do I need to do this?" Sarah asked. "Probably 6 to 8 weeks, until it's old enough to start eating on its own," Dr. Williamson replied. "And the schedule will need to be maintained even if you get sick or need to travel. This bird is now completely dependent on you." The weight of responsibility hit Sarah like a physical force. She was committing to 2 months of round-the-clock care for a creature she had known for less than 24 hours. Her job at the park would have to be rearranged. Her personal life would have to be put on hold. Everything would revolve around keeping this tiny bird alive. But, when she looked down at the hatchling, now nestled comfortably in its new brooder and peeping softly for its next meal, Sarah knew she had no choice. This bird had survived against impossible odds. She was going to make sure its fight had been worth it. Dr. Williamson stayed for 3 days, monitoring the hatchling's progress and making sure Sarah was confident with all the care procedures. During this time, the bird's personality began to emerge. It was surprisingly feisty for something so small, squawking loudly when hungry and settling down contentedly after each meal. It seemed to recognize Sarah's voice and would often become more active when she approached. "It's imprinting on you, Dr. Williamson explained. "This bird is going to think you're its parent." "That's both good and bad news." "What do you mean?" "Good news is that it will be easier to care for and train. Bad news is that releasing it back to the wild becomes much more complicated. Imprinted birds often can't survive on their own because they never learned proper survival behaviors from their real parents." This was something Sarah hadn't considered. She had assumed that once the bird was old enough and strong enough, she would simply let it go and it would live a normal wild life. Now she realized that her decision to save its life might have condemned it to a lifetime in captivity. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Dr. Williamson said, seeing Sarah's worried expression. "Right now, let's focus on keeping it healthy and growing. There are programs for rehabilitating imprinted birds, and, with proper training, many of them can be successfully released." As Dr. Williamson prepared to leave, she gave Sarah a thick binder full of information about bird development, nutrition, and healthcare. She also left behind several weeks' worth of specialized formula and feeding supplies. "Call me anytime, day or night, if you're worried about anything," she said. Even the smallest changes in behavior or appetite can be significant with birds this young. After the veterinarian left, Sarah was alone with her new responsibility. Marcus had returned to his regular duties, though he helped with feedings when possible. The ranger station had become a makeshift bird nursery, with the brooder set up in the corner of the main office where Sarah could monitor it constantly. The routine quickly took over Sarah's life. She set alarms every 30 minutes during the day to ensure she never missed a feeding. She learned to prepare formula in advance and keep it at the proper temperature. She became expert at reading the hatchling's behavior, the different sounds it made when hungry, sleepy, or uncomfortable. Slowly, the bird began to grow. Its eyes opened fully and became more responsive to light and movement. Tiny pin feathers started to emerge along its wings and back. Most remarkably, despite its albinism, it showed no signs of the health problems that often affected such birds in the wild. Word about the rescue spread quickly through the local community. News of the albino hatchling saved from acid rain captured people's imagination. Visitors started coming to the ranger station, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous bird. Sarah had to limit access to protect the hatchling from stress, but she began taking photos and videos to share with the growing number of people following the story. A local newspaper ran a feature article about the rescue, and soon regional television stations picked up the story. Sarah found herself being interviewed by reporters who wanted to know about the bird's progress and her round-the-clock care routine. "Why are you doing this?" one reporter asked. "Wouldn't it have been easier to just let nature take its course?" Sarah thought about the question as she looked at the hatchling, now 3 weeks old and growing stronger every day. "Because sometimes nature needs a little help," she said finally. This bird didn't choose to be albino, and it didn't choose to fall into an acid rainstorm. But it chose to fight for life, and I chose to fight alongside it. The bird had indeed chosen to fight. Despite all the challenges it faced, it continued to grow and develop. Its appetite was strong, and it gained weight steadily. Its feathers were coming in beautifully white and soft. Its movements became more coordinated as its nervous system matured. But Sarah knew the biggest challenges were still ahead. Soon the bird would need to learn to fly, to find food on its own, and to behave like a wild creature instead of a pet. The question of whether it could ever be released remained unanswered. For now, though, Sarah was content to focus on the daily miracle of watching new life grow and thrive under her care. Every morning when she arrived at the station, the the first sound she heard was the hatchling's greeting call. It had learned to recognize her footsteps and would start peeping excitedly when it knew she was approaching. These moments reminded Sarah why she had become a park ranger in the first place, to protect and preserve the incredible diversity of life in the natural world. The acid rain had been a disaster, but it had also revealed the strength and resilience that existed in the smallest and most vulnerable creatures. The albino hatchling was living proof that sometimes, with enough care and determination, even the most impossible circumstances could lead to beautiful outcomes. 6 weeks after the rescue, the albino bird had transformed from a helpless hatchling into a beautiful young creature with pristine white feathers and bright, intelligent eyes. Sarah had learned to identify it as a Carolina chickadee, a common species in the Appalachian forests, though this individual was anything but common. The bird, which Sarah had started calling Snow, had grown large enough to require a bigger enclosure. Marcus had helped her build a large flight cage outside the ranger station, complete with natural branches, feeding stations, and sheltered areas. Snow was beginning to show signs of wanting to fly, flapping its wings vigorously whenever Sarah approached. Dr. Williamson visited every 2 weeks to check on Snow's progress and help plan the next stages of its development. During her most recent visit, she had brought encouraging news. "The flight feathers are developing perfectly," she said, examining Snow's wings. "And look at this muscle development. This bird is going to be a strong flyer." But she also brought sobering reminders about the challenges ahead. "We need to start thinking seriously about flight training and wild behavior modification. Snow is now old enough to begin learning the skills it would have learned from its parents." This meant Sarah's role had to change dramatically. Instead of being a nurturing parent figure, she needed to become a strict teacher who would gradually reduce Snow's dependence on humans. It was one of the hardest transitions she had ever had to make. The first step was teaching Snow to find its own food. Dr. Williamson had brought a variety of insects, seeds, and other natural foods that chickadees ate in the wild. Instead of hand-feeding Snow formula, Sarah began placing these items around the cage and encouraging the bird to forage for them. Snow was confused and frustrated at first. It was used to being fed directly and couldn't understand why Sarah wasn't providing meals on schedule. The bird would fly to the cage door and call loudly whenever Sarah appeared, expecting its usual feeding routine. "This is the hardest part for both of you, Dr. Williamson explained as they watched Snow struggle to figure out how to crack open a sunflower seed. "But it's essential. A bird that can't forage successfully will never survive in the wild." Sarah had to steel herself against Snow's obvious distress. It broke her heart to see the bird she had nursed from near death looking at her with what seemed like confusion and betrayal. But she knew this tough love was necessary if Snow was ever going to have a chance at freedom. Gradually, Snow began to understand. It learned to pick up seeds with its beak and manipulate them until they cracked open. It discovered how to find insects hiding under pieces of bark. Most importantly, it learned to be constantly alert and searching for food, instead of waiting passively to be fed. The flight training began when Snow was 8 weeks old. Sarah would take the bird out of its cage and encourage it to fly short distances between her hands and nearby perches. At first, Snow could barely manage a few feet before landing clumsily. But chickadees are naturally strong flyers, and Snow's abilities improved rapidly. Within 2 weeks, Snow could fly the length of the ranger station's main room with confidence. Its navigation skills developed quickly, and it learned to land precisely on small branches and narrow perches. Sarah began taking it outside on calm days, where it could practice flying longer distances in a more natural environment. During these outdoor sessions, something remarkable began to happen. Wild chickadees started appearing around the ranger station. They seemed curious about Snow, calling to it from nearby trees and sometimes flying close to investigate this unusual white member of their species. They recognized Snow as one of their own, Dr. Williamson observed during one of these encounters. "That's extremely encouraging. It means Snow is displaying normal chickadee behaviors despite being hand-raised." But the wild birds' reactions were mixed. While some showed curiosity or even acceptance, others seemed alarmed by Snow's appearance. Albino animals often faced discrimination from their own species, who sometimes perceived their unusual coloring as a sign of illness or genetic weakness. Sarah watched these interactions with growing concern. Even if Snow learned all the necessary survival skills, would it be accepted by wild flocks? Chickadees were social birds who relied on flock membership for protection and finding food. A bird rejected by its own species might not survive even if it had all the right abilities. These concerns became more urgent as Snow reached full adult size and began showing signs of sexual maturity. Male chickadees established territories and found mates during their first spring, which was now only a few months away. If Snow was going to be released, it needed to happen soon, while it was still young enough to integrate into wild social structures. Dr. Williamson arranged for Snow to spend time at a wildlife rehabilitation center that specialized in preparing hand-raised birds for release. The center had large flight aviaries where Snow could practice its skills alongside other chickadees and learn proper flock behavior. The day Sarah had to transfer Snow to the rehabilitation center was one of the most difficult of her life. She had spent nearly 3 months caring for this bird, watching it grow from a dying hatchling into a healthy, beautiful adult. Snow had become a part of her daily routine and, if she was honest, a part of her heart. Snow seemed to sense that something important was happening. It was more vocal than usual during the car ride to the rehabilitation center, calling out frequently as if trying to communicate something urgent to Sarah. When they arrived and Sarah had to place Snow in its new, temporary enclosure, the bird flew immediately to the side closest to her and pressed against the mesh. "This is always the hardest part," said Jane Rodriguez, the center's director. "But you should be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. This bird has a real chance at a wildlife because of your dedication." Sarah visited Snow every few days during its stay at the rehabilitation center. She watched as it learned to interact with other chickadees and developed the social skills it would need in the wild. Snow was initially submissive to the other birds, having never learned the aggressive behaviors that chickadees used to establish their place in the flock hierarchy. But, gradually, Snow began to assert itself. It learned to compete for the best food sources and roosting spots. It developed the quick, darting flight patterns that chickadees used to avoid predators. Most importantly, it stopped looking to humans for food or comfort and began relying entirely on its own abilities. The rehabilitation process took 6 weeks. During this time, Sarah threw herself into learning everything she could about post-release monitoring of wildlife. She wanted to be prepared to track Snow's progress and intervene if necessary after its release. She learned about radio telemetry systems that could track individual birds for months after release. She studied chickadee behavior patterns and seasonal movements. She identified the best release locations where Snow would have access to food, water, and potential mates while being far enough from human activity to encourage truly wild behavior. Dr. Williamson helped Sarah design a monitoring protocol that would give Snow the best chance of successful adaptation to wildlife. They would track the bird's movements, feeding behavior, and social interactions for at least 6 months after release. If Snow showed signs of struggling to survive on its own, they would have the option of recapturing it and placing it in a permanent sanctuary. "We're giving Snow every advantage we can," Dr. Williamson explained. "But, ultimately, the bird will decide whether it can make the transition to wildlife. Some hand-raised birds do beautifully, others never quite adapt. We have to be prepared for either outcome." As the release date approached, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. She was proud of how far Snow had come and hopeful that it would thrive in the wild. But she also knew that once the bird was released, its survival would depend on factors beyond her control. The weather, the presence of predators, the availability of food, the acceptance of wild flocks, all of these would play a role in determining Snow's fate. Sarah had done everything possible to prepare the bird for these challenges, but she couldn't protect it from them. Jane Rodriguez scheduled the release for a warm morning in early spring, when insect activity was high and chickadee pairs were beginning to establish nesting territories. The location was a mature forest preserve about 20 miles from where Sarah had first found Snow as a hatchling. Snow seemed different on the morning of the release. It was more alert and restless than Sarah had seen it in weeks, as if it somehow sensed that freedom was approaching. When Sarah approached its transport cage, Snow didn't fly to greet her as it usually did. Instead, it perched quietly in the center of the cage, looking out at the forest beyond. The moment had finally arrived. After months of intensive care, training, and preparation, Snow was ready to return to the wild. Sarah felt her heart racing as she prepared to open the cage door and watch the bird she had saved fly away into the unknown. The morning of Snow's release dawned clear and warm, with gentle breezes and the kind of perfect spring weather that made all living things want to be active. Sarah arrived at the forest preserve before sunrise, wanting to have everything ready when the optimal release time came. Dr. Williamson and Jane Rodriguez were already there, along with 2 graduate students who would help with the radio telemetry monitoring. They had chosen a secluded meadow surrounded by mature oak and hickory trees, perfect chickadee habitat with plenty of insects, seeds, and nesting sites. Snow's transport cage sat on a table in the center of the meadow. Sarah could see the bird moving restlessly inside, its white feathers catching the early morning light like snow caught in sunbeams. After months of captivity, Snow was about to experience true freedom for the first time since it was a helpless hatchling. "Are you ready for this?" Dr. Williamson asked gently, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure she would ever be truly ready to let Snow go. "As ready as I can be." The researchers finished setting up their monitoring equipment. They had attached a tiny radio transmitter to Snow's leg, so small and light it would not interfere with the bird's flight or behavior, but powerful enough to track its movements for several months. Jane Rodriguez ran through the release protocol one final time. They would open the cage door and step back, allowing Snow to leave on its own timeline. Forced releases often resulted in panicked birds that flew blindly and became lost or injured. Snow needed to make the choice to leave when it felt ready. "Remember, this might take a while," Jane said. "Some birds fly away immediately, others sit in the open cage for hours before venturing out. There's no right or wrong way for this to happen." Sarah approached the cage with trembling hands. Snow looked up at her with those familiar pale pink eyes, and, for a moment Sarah felt like she was back in the ranger station, feeding formula to a tiny hatchling that could barely hold up its head. How far they had both come since that terrible day in the acid rain. She slowly unlatched the cage door and pulled it open. Snow cocked its head to one side, studying the opening with obvious curiosity. The bird could see and smell the forest beyond, could hear the calls of wild birds in the distance. But it made no immediate move toward freedom. The group waited in tense silence. Minutes passed. Snow hopped to different perches inside the cage, always staying close to the open door but never quite crossing the threshold. Sarah began to worry that something was wrong, that Snow was too afraid or too dependent to leave. Then, without warning, Snow hopped to the cage opening and paused there for just a moment before launching itself into the air. Its flight was strong and sure as it headed straight for the nearest oak tree, landing gracefully on a branch about 30 feet away. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she watched Snow look around its new environment. The bird called out once, a clear, strong chickadee note that carried across the meadow. Almost immediately, an answering call came from deeper in the forest. "That's a good sign," whispered Dr. Williamson. "Wild chickadees are responding to Snow's calls. They recognize it as one of their own." For the next hour, the research team observed Snow's behavior from a distance. The bird explored its new surroundings methodically, flying from tree to tree and investigating potential food sources. It found a cluster of aphids on one branch and ate them efficiently, demonstrating that its foraging training had been successful. More encouraging still, a small flock of wild chickadees gradually approached the area where Snow was exploring. They didn't flee when they saw the albino bird, though they kept their distance and watched its behavior carefully. "It's like they're evaluating Snow," one of the graduate students observed. "Deciding whether to accept it into the group." Sarah watched this interaction with her heart in her throat. So much of Snow's future survival depended on being accepted by a wild flock. Solitary chickadees rarely lived long in the wild, lacking the protection and shared knowledge that came with group membership. As the morning progressed, the wild birds gradually moved closer to Snow. There were a few brief aggressive encounters, quick chases, and territorial displays that were normal parts of chickadee social behavior. But, overall, the interactions seemed positive. Around midday, something remarkable happened. The wild flock began moving through the forest in their typical feeding pattern, and Snow joined them. The albino bird had been accepted, at least temporarily, into a wild chickadee group. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Williamson said, monitoring Snow's movements through binoculars. "Most hand-raised birds take weeks or months to achieve this level of social integration, if they manage it at all." Sarah watched through her own binoculars as Snow flew with the flock, following their lead as they searched for food in the forest canopy. The white bird was clearly visible among its gray companions, but it was behaving like a wild chickadee in every way. As afternoon approached, it was time for the research team to withdraw and let Snow begin its new life without human observation. The radio telemetry equipment would track the bird's movements automatically, and they would return in a few days to check on its progress from a distance. Sarah took one last look at Snow through her binoculars. The bird was busy investigating a cluster of seeds, completely focused on the task at hand. It looked healthy, confident, and wild. The helpless hatchling she had found in the acid rain had become exactly what it was meant to be. The drive back to the ranger station was quiet. Sarah felt emotionally drained but also deeply satisfied. She had accomplished something she hadn't been sure was possible, successfully raising and releasing a hand-raised albino bird back to the wild. Over the following weeks, the radio telemetry data provided encouraging updates on Snow's progress. The bird was traveling with the same chickadee flock and had established a territory within their range. It was maintaining its weight and showing normal activity patterns. Most remarkably, Snow seemed to have learned to compensate for the visual challenges that typically affected albino animals. Chickadees with normal vision often relied heavily on their eyesight for finding food and avoiding predators, but Snow had developed enhanced hearing and touch senses that made up for its visual limitations. 3 months after the release, Dr. Williamson brought news that made Sarah's heart soar. The radio telemetry had detected Snow engaging in courtship behaviors with a female chickadee from its adopted flock. If Snow successfully mates and raises young, it will be one of the most successful albino bird rehabilitations ever documented, Dr. Williamson explained. The fact that a wild female has accepted Snow as a potential mate suggests that it has completely integrated into chickadee society. 6 months after release, the researchers confirmed that Snow had indeed mated and was helping to raise a clutch of 4 healthy chicks in a nest cavity about 2 miles from the release site. None of the chicks showed signs of albinism, but they carried the genetic trait and might pass it on to future generations. Sarah visited the nesting area once, observing from a respectful distance with powerful binoculars. She watched Snow emerge from the nest cavity carrying a beak full of insects, food for the chicks inside. The bird looked completely natural and wild, showing no signs of the human imprinting that had once threatened to keep it captive forever. As Snow disappeared back into the nest cavity, Sarah realized that her job was truly finished. The bird no longer needed her protection or care. It had become a successful wild animal, contributing to the continuation of its species and living the life it was meant to live. The acid rain disaster that had nearly killed Snow as a hatchling had led to one of the most successful wildlife rehabilitation stories Sarah had ever been part of. The tiny bird had not only survived against impossible odds, but had thrived and found its place in the natural world. News of Snow's successful release and breeding spread through wildlife rehabilitation networks around the world. Sarah received messages from researchers and rehabilitators on every continent, sharing their own stories of challenging rescues and asking for advice based on her experience. She realized that Snow's story had become more than just one bird's journey to freedom. It had become a symbol of hope for wildlife conservationists everywhere, proving that even the most vulnerable creatures could overcome tremendous obstacles with proper care and dedication. The ranger station where Snow had spent its first months of life became a destination for wildlife enthusiasts hoping to hear the story firsthand. Sarah found herself giving tours and presentations about the rescue, always emphasizing the importance of protecting habitat and preventing pollution that could cause future acid rain disasters. The forest around the ranger station gradually recovered from the acid rain damage. New leaves grew on damaged trees, and wildlife populations slowly returned to normal levels. But Sarah never forgot the lesson that disaster had taught her about the resilience of nature and the power of human compassion. 2 years after Snow's release, Sarah received the ultimate confirmation of the rescue's success. Researchers conducting a bird banding survey in the area captured and photographed an albino chickadee that they were able to identify as Snow through its radio transmitter records. The bird was healthy, fully integrated into a wild flock, and showed no signs of the human dependence that wildlife rehabilitators always feared in hand-raised animals. Snow had become completely wild, and that was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. Standing in the forest where she had first found a tiny, dying hatchling in the acid rain, Sarah smiled as she listened to the calls of wild chickadees in the trees above. Somewhere among those voices was Snow, living proof that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion could have the most profound results. The story that began with tragedy had become a celebration of life's incredible ability to heal, adapt, and thrive. Snow was no longer just a rescued bird, it was a living symbol of hope for the future of wildlife conservation and the enduring bond between humans and the natural world they were meant to protect.